Hello and good morning. Well, I think we'll get started and try and keep the day on schedule. So welcome to our panel on hemophilia. As many of you know, today hemophilia is managed primarily through clotting factor concentrates, which requires frequent treatment and really impacts patients' quality of life. Gene therapy has the potential to treat patients in new ways, reducing overall cost and improving quality of life. So today we have a great panel here to discuss gene therapies for hemophilia. We'll make sure to leave some time at the end of our short session for questions from the audience. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Jerry Keybl, and I head up cell and gene therapy manufacturing at MilliporeSigma. We support the manufacture of novel therapies through products and contract manufacturing and testing services. Today, I'm serving as the panel's moderator. Let me do some brief introductions of the other panelists, starting from your left. I have Dan Levin sitting right next to me. He is the Global Hemophilia Marketing Lead for the Pfizer Rare Disease Group. He also oversees new product planning and commercialization for Pfizer's late-stage gene therapy portfolio focused on hemophilia. Dan has spent more than 20 years focused on global strategic marketing. Immediately next to him, we have Garen. John serves as the Chief Business Officer at uniQure and is responsible for business development, alliance management, and commercialization. He has been responsible for business transactions over the last 15 years at Cirrus Pharmaceuticals and Forest Labs. And last but not least, we have Sandy Macrae sitting on the end. Sandy serves as Sangamo's president and CEO and is a member of the company's board of directors. He has 20 years of experience in the pharmaceutical industry, including roles in medical affairs, R&D, and business development. Most recently serving as global medical officer at Takeda. Let's extend a warm welcome to the panelists. So I think we'll start with a rather general question that'll kind of provide context for how we're all thinking about this. So the question I'd like to ask, and I'll give each of the panelists an opportunity to answer, is around what makes hemophilia a strong candidate for gene therapy, and what's the value proposition for patients? So maybe we'll start on next to me with Dan.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Jerry, and thank you for having me here. I can tell you, I've spent really a career in hemophilia, and so I look at it from really two different aspects. One is that hemophilia is a great target because of the technical and clinical aspects of the disease, well characterized. A single gene, really good surrogate endpoints that I think are good representatives of clinical endpoints. But I think what's most important to me is knowing these patients and these caregivers is really the unmet need. And so when I look at the unmet need, and there are treatments, as you mentioned, and they're good treatments that have been developed and honed over many years. But make no mistake, daily, weekly, regular infusions are very invasive for these patients. And while they've done an excellent job coping with that, and certainly the subcutaneous therapies that are coming out now certainly make that better, and extended half-lives make that better, but still they're incredibly invasive, and even the newer ones are still disruptive. So at the end of the day, you have hemophilia as a great target from a clinical technical standpoint, and then you have great unmet need also. So I think the combination of those match up to really a great target. That's my opinion.
Thank you.
Yes, so I'm trying not to repeat the things that Dan said, but I would add a few points to hemophilia. First of all, from the standpoint of gene therapy, only a couple of years ago, I think it may be difficult to take ourselves back a couple of years, but gene therapy was viewed as something that would be used as a last resort, where it was really a huge safety hurdle for a lot of people with this permanent installation of a gene. So it's a little bit of a different environment today. But thinking about that period, hemophilia really was an excellent target to go after for a number of reasons. First of all, you have a very well-validated serum biomarker, either factor VIII or factor IX activity. And that really helps to determine whether when you get into humans, you're having the desired effect very quickly, which is not always easy to do. And then it's also an area that has, as was described, a significant level of unmet need. The patients, as was already discussed, have certainly therapies today, which does help from the point of view of defining the market opportunity, and it's very fortunate that that's available, but there is a significant level of unmet need. So part of the argument is purely economic in terms of what level of factor 8 or 9 recombinant medicines you are not having to administer to the patients anymore, and of course the cost associated with that. And that's a really good starting point for an economic argument. And then you can build on top of that all the additional value, which is very important. And I think part of the challenge will be aligning some of that perception from the view of the patients, the payers, and the caregivers. But there's a whole range of improvements in quality of life and the benefit of steady state levels without peaks and troughs and so forth. So I think it's a really good area to begin some work in gene therapy.
So being third's always hardest. And the technical reasons both of you have said are absolutely correct. But I think I would take it a different way. When you talk to the patients, and we bring patients into Sangamo regularly to remind us why we're doing this, you hear stories of mothers holding down 3-year-olds to get a line in them to try and give them factor, which I cannot imagine what that must feel like. And young men that come in and see us and talk about having to, one young man was taking $3.2 million of factor each year so as he could live his life normally. And that's what we need to offer these patients and these people. Hemophilia is great for all the reasons you described, but it's also a community that has grown up learning to control its life. Young men that learn to treat themselves and give themselves factor and treat themselves with factor so as they can do normal things in the world. And a community that went through that whole factor in HIV scandal and difficulty. So they're a community that has very strong views of what they're looking for from any new medicine and hold all of us to extremely high standards of what's expected, which is why having a range of options of treatment fits very nicely with the hemophilia community and the wisdom and experience they have and the desire they have to look after their children.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really powerful story. And I think that's probably a great segue into the next topic. So, I think everyone on this stage shares that vision about helping the patient and putting that patient first. But we also notice that everyone's from different companies, right? Which also means that you guys are competitors. And maybe, Sandy, since you had the last take, we'll go to you first on this one. But I'd really love if you could share a bit about your approach to commercial strategy and geography and timing with the audience.
So we made a deliberate decision to partner with Pfizer. So by the time we come to the end of the line, I'll have used all your answers. And we did that for a very specific reason, because I think this is a global disease with a significant number of patients and a significant number of competitors in the market. And therefore, a small company like us may not be the best people to get access to reimbursement and get our medicine to patients. And when we looked at this, we decided to go through a process and have lots of people bid for partnering with Sangamo. And we chose Pfizer because they're Pfizer, because they'll be able to get the medicine into as many global locations and get reimbursement in the US and in other places, because that's what they're good at. And it has been a very good partnership, so I'll leave it to my friend and colleague to explain how they're going to do it, and I'm listening intently. There is a moment at this conference. I've been coming to this conference now for 2 years, and the first year, even that, there's been an enormous change. The first year there was academics up here with pictures of DNA and how you would do this or that, and now you've got companies up here, including companies like Pfizer and Sanofi and Gilead involved in this space, and it's a real medicine, real drug development space now. So it's a very different place, and the idea that this is no longer an academic discussion about reimbursement, but a real one, I think is a great credit to the people in the room.
And I think you threw it very nicely over to Dan next on.
Oh, okay. So I have to respond to that, Sandy. I definitely agree, Sandy. I think Sangamo made a very nice choice, and I think we have a nice partnership. And I can tell you, personally, I've been in the hemophilia space since about 1997 or so, and so life has certainly changed in hemophilia since that time. But a couple things to talk about. Well, I know we're going to get a little bit in the regulatory aspect of things, but the idea of speeding these drugs to market is incredibly compelling, and what we're hearing from regulatory agencies around the world certainly makes it exciting. But for me, if you didn't hear the pressure that Sandy just put on me previously, but the time pressure is certainly there. So it just means everything has to be done sooner. And as we heard in the previous talk, these are not simple things that have to be overcome. But the good news from our perspective is that we think we have a really good understanding of the hemophilia community out there, the way that it's treated, the way that payers think about it, and hopefully that can translate into success for us. I do want to mention one of the things you talked about was kind of the location and the globalization, and just one of the experiences that I've had over a long time is working with the World Federation of Hemophilia, and they talk about 75% of the world is still people with bleeding disorders are still undertreated or untreated. And so when we think about where do we go first, what's the world, we certainly think about the developed world first. But the developing world is very compelling also, certainly from a need-based perspective. And so this idea of leapfrogging, and bringing some of these countries directly to gene therapy is incredibly enticing, incredibly exciting. And so that is one of the things that we're looking at and thinking about. Are there ways to do that in a transformative way? Where do you do that first? Which countries make more sense to do that in? But I think there still needs to be the aspect of getting countries in the developing world to recognize hemophilia as an important priority. And so I think that's the first step that we can do, and maybe that we have some advantages because of our hemophilia experience and the people that we have out in the world now. But we think that would be the first step, and then moving eventually to looking at what countries could really leapfrog and move right to gene therapy, not just in the developed world.
Yeah, so I would certainly add to these comments that from our perspective, we're just getting started in the commercialization activities. Phase 3 has just begun, and that's something that we're very engaged in right now, ramping up. And so there's a lot to think about. Part of it is what I had mentioned before, is just aligning. We have some very basic very basic foundation, given that there's an existing market for recombinant factor, at least in the United States and the developing world. And I appreciate the comments about the rest of the world, because I think that's an important, intricate aspect of the commercialization in gene therapy. But within the developing world, you have that as a basis. It's important to establish alignment between what the value proposition is for patients, caregivers, and payers. And that's some of the activity that we're working on. It's not just about what is the value proposition to payers. It's really bringing these into alignment. And the good news, again, is with a very well-developed market and a community, you have the basis for doing that. And so now it's really about generating the evidence and having the conversation. So we're very much engaged in doing these kinds of activities. And this is a key component of the approach that we're taking. And then, as I would say, I would echo the comments on the worldwide opportunity here. It's in the leapfrogging, a bit like how cell phones leapfrogged landlines in the third world. You have an opportunity to bring people to a center, treat them once, and then they never, presumably, or for a long time, need to be treated again. They will need to be followed. So there's important details in how you do this, but you do have the opportunity to avoid the complexity of an ongoing therapy reaching patients who don't either have means to pay or the infrastructure to do so. So that's a really good opportunity and something we fully intend to pursue.
Yeah. John, I think that's great. There's something there that I wanted to build on, which is it's obviously really important to get the product to the patients, right? And so how are you thinking about manufacturing and supply chain in the context of this commercialization strategy?
Yes, and supply has always been a critical part of the conversation when it comes to gene and cell therapy. It's complicated. As many of you know, it's like MABs in the 90s, but even perhaps another degree of complexity. And so there's been a lot of focus on manufacturing as part of development because of the role that it plays as you scale up and change your process to whatever extent is necessary. So that's something we grappled with from a development and regulatory perspective already when we established a manufacturing facility in the United States at a large scale. And so that's something that we already fully appreciate. Now at the commercial level, it even gets to be a bigger question, both in terms of how you are able to distribute and supply the needs of patients. Again, the good news here a little bit is you have some level of flexibility because patients in many cases, not necessarily in the developing world, but in many cases do have options that can keep them going until the time that they are ready and the time that the reimbursement is available, so that you can schedule their treatment at a particular time and supply it appropriately. That would not necessarily be the case if there was indications that didn't have those options available. So we have the ability to plan a little bit, but there's no question that having a manufacturing facility that can supply the entire world, having secondary supply that will support that facility in case something goes wrong, and anticipating your demand. And I think the other aspect of it is that many of you may know that, especially in the gene therapy, AAV gene therapy, if you consider that you will go through your prevalent population in a certain time frame and then be mostly focused on the incident population, you have to be prepared for a drop in the demand sooner than you would expect if you were delivering a small molecule that people took on a regular basis. So you have to be able to ramp up and ramp down. So flexibility in supply and flexible arrangements for supply will be very, very important, no question. So it's something, again, that we have put a lot of thought into, and now we're moving on from the support of development to the support of commercialization.
Great, thank you for that. I actually want to touch on something we alluded to a little bit earlier, where we were talking about regulation and kind of getting these new therapies to patients. So how are accelerated regulatory platforms influencing the development and kind of where you guys are? Maybe, I'll throw this one to you, Sandy. How are you thinking about, moving very quickly, kind of in the face of this opportunity to get things to patients sooner?
Quickly but prudently, because this is still a new field, and if you think that the debate and discussion that goes around Spark and BioMarin's results, and have they succeeded or have they not, seems to me that we've somewhat lost the plot when what has happened with those two companies, because they're ahead of everyone else by a little. We have the first patients that are cured or relieved of their hemophilia. I mean, there's a moment where we as an industry need to step back and appreciate that we've done something important here and we've moved a field forward. And the agency is trying to keep up with this. And how you would decide if these are appropriate for registration and approval and release into patients isn't going to be simple. So I think the FDA's come back with something saying you could get approval on factor levels, which is great. I think that's a really flexible, innovative thing that Gottlieb's brought in. But what's the right factor level, and how long does that factor level have to be available to the patient? It opens up a whole new box that none of us had ever considered or hadn't been properly debated. And so these patients are going to have our medicines in them for a significant length of time. We have to balance this urgency that we want to get there, and from a commercial point of view, the excitement of getting registration and approval and getting out and making it available, with doing it well and prudently so as the patients are getting the best medicines. Our analysis of it is that when we speak to patients, they're going to wait and choose the right one. At the moment, they have treatment that is sufficient and allows them to control their life. So it isn't as with MPS, which is the other disease we're in, where patients are urgently wanting it now immediately. With hemophilia, I think we'll see a very unusual launch process where they'll wait. There'll be an opinion from the hemophilia societies and various support groups, and they'll choose which is the best one. And so the regulators are only part of this equation. If you want to understand how good the regulators are, try doing something like diabetes or Alzheimer's, and you'll see how difficult it is in large population diseases. I think the FDA particularly is bending over backwards to try and help us all get these to patients, and it's our job to get the right medicine to the right patient.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Maybe one final question before I open it up to the audience for questions. And this one, maybe I'll ask to you, Dan. We were talking about getting these therapies to patients, and one really important part of this is access and pricing. And how do you envision the likely reimbursement strategy for gene therapies in hemophilia to kind of unfold? I mean, we heard earlier today some examples from colleagues at Spark and Novartis, right? But how are you thinking about it in this context?
Yeah. So I'll tell you, the one thing that keeps me up at night, is the access side. So when I think about, the progress, just as Sandy talked about, the very, positive changes that we're seeing from a regulatory environment, to thinking about the necessity to be ready in every way and to be ready faster. And what keeps me up at night is that we have, all the technology, we have the products approved, and yet we still don't have reimbursement figured out. So that's why I'm so thrilled to be at a meeting such as this, where you have a whole organization like ARM really trying to focus on making that happen. So that's really critical for us. But I think there's some really unique things about hemophilia. They were talked about this morning, but I thought maybe just to bring a little bit more context to that is, the cost offset aspect of hemophilia, I think makes for a much more a simpler and easier conversation to have with payers, and we've already had that conversation with payers, and I'll tell you, they've been very positive in their response to that, and I think one of the most surprising aspects of this is that we talk about the value, it was very talked about this morning, but the value that these therapies can bring beyond simply the cost offset. The cost offset is very valuable to start with, but the value beyond that is, these really do change patients' lives in a profound way, and we see them. Patients already, as Sandy mentioned, and we see in clinical studies, patients that have had to take factor their entire lives. All of a sudden, they get one-time infusion and they don't. And that's pretty life-changing for them. And while we want to put in the measurements in our studies to make sure that we can prove that value to payers, in just discussing that with payers in the short term, they actually see the value, beyond simply the cost offset. And that's incredibly, heartening to me. Payers are not an easy audience, as you guys know, and to get them to realize that there's value simply beyond cost offset is critically important here. And so our job is to make sure that we can prove that value, and and it's so different around the world about how you prove that. And there was some discussion about that this morning. I'm not going to get into that. So it becomes really a conversation about logistically how do you make that happen. If you believe that there's value there, then it becomes, well, how do you pay for a one-time therapy that's going to substitute for years and years of very expensive therapies. So and that's the aspect, whether it's the logistics or regulatory aspects or legal aspects that really have to be worked out. But I think it's pretty good progress. We always have the people that are paying for the drug realize that there's value here beyond simply that offset.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. So I think we heard what's keeping Dan up at night, but now it's an opportunity for you. What's keeping you guys up at night? And you'd love to ask the panel about. Happy to take your questions.
So I have a question. Sandy, you mentioned that you thought that patients in stable diseases or that had opportunities would maybe kind of wait and choose what was the best product. And so maybe regulatory agencies didn't have as much of a say there in what patients were going to decide. What is the reaction, though, to the new clarification that's come out of Europe on orphan drug designation? Because it seems to imply that they're going to take a fairly broad view of what's a similar product, and it seems to imply that potentially the first one to market wins with that orphan drug designation.
That would be unfortunate because there isn't one that wins. Even within the hemophilia space, the number of parameters that the analysts try and tease us apart is immunogenicity, stability, predictability, and then it will be cost of goods and availability. So I would imagine if you look across the companies, Spark, BioMarin, and Pfizer, that will be launching hemophilia A products, there is a need for choice. And I think one can't win because each one of them will offer something different. So just to be clear about my comments, I think that the agency will be the determinant of what is safe and effective to take us forward. But I think it then becomes to the payers what becomes available, and that's a more complex discussion with the manufacturer and the payer. So I think if Europe ends up with one wins, it's a mistake.
Other questions?
I guess I'd like to ask essentially the same question I asked of the last panel. Dan, in your conversations with commercial payers, how are they, given that hemophilia is a larger indication than some others that we've talked about, how are they thinking about coping with the idea of payment over time?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a broad question. I mean, there's U.S. and then there's certainly no Europe. There's just 29 different payers across. So commercial payers. Okay, so commercial payers. So overall, they see the value, in hemophilia. I mean, it's the one disease area, which is my other point about why I think it makes hemophilia so attractive. That this also provides some precedent, I think, for other therapies. I think the cost offset makes the argument, much more. It plays much better with those payers. But they yet don't have the solution either. And it's interesting. The larger payers, are less concerned about this. Things like transportability, what happens when patients switch plans, et cetera. Because for larger players, it all works out. In the wash, they get some, they lose some, et cetera. But the smaller players are certainly more concerned about that. What happens if they get 4 and they had 0, and or the opposite. They have to pay for 4 and 4 leave a plan. So all those logistical aspects are the things that need to be worked out. So the payers don't yet know how they're going to work with this, and there's different levels of concern depending on really the size of the payer. That's what I've seen.
Yeah, I would just add in our own experience in that as well. The willingness to pay for more than a year, multiple years of therapy seems quite well established. It is the transportability issue that becomes a little bit more complicated right now. Just a quick
And it's
comment.
probably easier in Europe because once you get approval, it's a government health system.
Single payer. Yeah.
Maybe one final question from the audience, is there? If not, I have one.
You're worried about the announcement, huh?
I'm going to be off this stage before President Trump interrupts me. No, the final question is, if we think about having this panel in 2 or 3 years, and I guess Janet wouldn't be here to be in Carlsbad potentially, but
It'll be in the Marriott by then.
What do you think the topics would be that would be the key focus areas for this gene therapy and hemophilia?
So in 3 years, I'm going to imagine that you have 3 agents on the market for hemophilia A.
Yeah.
You have 2 gene therapies for hemophilia B and a new genome editing one that will mean that young patients can be treated, launched there. It will be a much more commercial world.
Yeah.
It will be about differentiation. It will be about reimbursement and access. And it will be less about the fine details of which capsid each one of us used.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts?
We'll also know so much more about the durability of effect by then. I mean, just simply, it's empirically, you have to you can't really predict durability without seeing durability. So 3 years from now, I predict we'll have 3 more years of data.
That seems like a safe prediction. Yeah.
Dan, how long does it have to be durable for?
That's a good question, Sandy. I think it depends on how you set up the reimbursement. From a guarantee perspective, maybe it doesn't matter. You pay for as long as it works, as an example. But I think to make the argument, as a one-time payment, we're thinking that we need to have durability in the 6, 7, 10 year timing.
Long term, yeah.
Maybe beyond that.
That would be wonderful.
I think that the very near future, which is very exciting in hemophilia, will be, as was described, a lot more options for patients, both with hemophilia A, hemophilia B, with inhibitors, without inhibitors. There's a lot going on, and that's a great place for the industry to deliver us and for patients to be at. So I think that's.
And if you go just a little longer, gene editing will replace gene therapy. So 5 years from now, it's a different conversation.
Indeed.
Zinc finger, perhaps.
Yeah,
Perhaps.
Wonderful. Well, everyone, please join me in thanking the panel, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you.